Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the shop. So I've got the passenger side fender on, and I'm going to step you through exactly how I did that on the driver's side. So we'll get that in a minute. But basically, the challenges that we're going to run into, and I'm going to talk about this later, is there are so many points where two panels come together. And in fact, the fenders are the worst because they come in contact with the cowl, the windshield trim, the door, the rocker, and of course the hood. And trying to get this flat everywhere is almost impossible. So as I'm going to talk about a little bit later, we're going to take a look at how much work is going to be needed to do just through the manipulation of the bolts and hammer and dolly. Because this isn't perfect here at all. I'm going to be able to maybe move the fender in and out with the bolt, but then I have to be cognizant that I don't lose this match. Also, the door can tilt in and out, so if I'm too high here and too low here, I can actually tilt the door. But I have to watch that because any tilting I do of the door is going to tilt the door back here, and I don't want to lose the flushness back here and also the flushness here. That's a ton of work that's going to have to be done, and all of that is got to be done before you even think of putting filler on this car. So, fender's on. Let me show you how I did it. Okay, so we have a fender. Now I put the extension on, right? Because again, I'm going to start doing some of the final body work on this car, so I need everything on the car so I can do that. Now, I also stole a little bit of a trick again from Barry over at Joe Daddy's Garage. I didn't use bolts to tighten or put the extensions on. I have replaced that with threaded rods. So instead of putting the piece in place and then putting a nut or a bolt behind it to tighten the extension onto the fender, what I've done is I put threaded rods into the extension, and then I put the extension in place and then just put nuts on the threaded rod. It's a lot easier to work with because the threaded rod sticks a lot deeper down into the fender, so it's easier to get the nut on. And the second thing is that when I paint the vehicle, just like Barry did, I'm going to put a set of nuts on the front of the fender, which means I'll be able to stand the extension off of the fender by about 1/2 inch, still have it on the fender, so that when I'm laying the paint down, the paint's going to lay onto the fender and onto the extension at the same time. Painting parts separately is dangerous. You never know, you get the mix wrong, you get the way it lays down wrong, the temperature is different that day. So in order to get consistency, the best way to do this is to try to paint it all at the same time, and preparation is everything. So let's put the fender on. So as I mentioned earlier, what I do is obviously the front clip's got to go, and then the back goes in, and we have a fender in place. Now what I do right away is I just simply take one of my fender bolts and just put it into the center here, a couple of twists. That way the fender's not going to fall off. Many times, and well, not many, but once at least, I put the fender on, it was sitting just like this, I walked away just to go get something, and boom, the fender falls off. So always put something in to hold the fender. Next thing, or the first thing that I'm going to do then, is in the back here. As you can see, I'm holding the fender, I'm trying to get it back towards the car, I'm trying to close this line up a bit here. But basically I'm going to put in this rear bolt. And actually it's stuck there for a second. I tell you, I don't know what's with these things. And then we're going to tighten that down. Yeah, you almost constant. I don't know what's going on. Again, I'm giving it pull, I'm pressing back here. And I tighten this back one. So now what that's done is giving me a bit of a gap. Now it's a little close back in the back here, but I'm assuming now, I bet you this fender's going to have to come in a bit, which will swing this out. But it's going to pivot here. So the next thing we do, and a very simple step, is we just take another fender bolt, come to the front of the vehicle, and we start to bring the hood down. And sure enough, we are way out here. So this now has to come in. And by bringing that in, it's going to open up the gap at the back because it's going to hinge. And we're going to lock it down here. Okay, so there we go. It's not tight yet. It's just in place, so I can bring this down one more time. We can look at the hood gap. There we go. It wasn't sitting properly. In the back here, there's a piece that's got to go behind the fender. I should have checked that first because now it's moved the fender on me. I see that's a lot different now because the fender twisted in, it took this gap. Bring the gap in. That looks fantastic. There we go. So what we've done is we've got the back bolt in place. I've got the front bolt in place now. And the other bolts, obviously, you're going to tighten them down. The reason is because it'll bring this fender up or down, right? Because we want to now obviously get this flush as well. So we do need to put those other bolts in. But not a big hurry yet because I'm not going to be doing this at this point. But as far as now, we have the front locked in. I've got the back locked in. And then we start looking at the door here now and starting to feel this gap. Now this is what I mentioned on the other side. I can take the bottom of this now and see, I can lift this up. So I can get this to the point where this is nice and level here, and then I tighten that bolt that goes in the back here, and then that'll freeze this area, and then I can manipulate the bottom of the fender. So let's get that bolt in. So the bolt is right in here, and I'm turning it in, and what it's going to do is there's a bracket in here that the two get connected to. So I'm just going to leave it loose for now, close the door, and I can feel that we're just a little low on the fender. The fender's got to come up just a bit. So what I can do is I can open the door again, get that bolt onto the nut, and now I'm going to lift the fender just that little bit. Just going to tighten it by hand. We're not bad, we're still a little low on the fender, so I'm going to loosen that up. But I'm going to support the fender as I loosen it so I don't lose the original position. And now I've just raised it just ever so slightly. And again, just hand tighten it. Oh, see, that's fantastic now. So we got a nice, as smooth as it can get, obviously. Again, these panels are 50 years old, but now at least that height is good. So what I can do now is I can take the ratchet, hit it on the nut, and tighten it down. That way there it's not going to move now. So now we've got this area set. Now what we're going to do is move down to the bottom. Now for the final adjustment, what I like to do is to loosen both of the nuts. Get the fender forward or back the way I want it by using anything that you want to do for the gap. Like if I take this in, now I know how deep the gap is, and I can set that gap everywhere. So that gives me the idea that I got a nice consistent gap. Once I get the gap the way I want it, I lock the front bolt in first. Why is that? Because that front bolt will now stop the fender from being able to move back and forth, but it doesn't stop the fender from moving in or out, right? Because that still can pivot because it's loose. I lock the front in, that ensures my gap is right, and then now I can either apply pressure or pull it out in order to get this as close as possible to the angle I want and not have to worry about losing my gap because the front bolt's holding it. So now that it's back the way I want it, I tighten that back bolt. And now, again, we're as close as we're going to get to a 50-year-old car. And I made this comment earlier. These things had a 1/8 inch tolerance. So when they came off the assembly line, I mean 1/8 of an inch gap difference between one side to the other, that was acceptable. We try now to get these things to the point where they're razor sharp and that it's almost impossible because they just weren't made that way. These cars were not made that way. And again, everything I'm doing, this car is on its suspension. Now, I wish I had my motor back because I would really love to have this car loaded down. but at least the fact that it's on its suspension, the car is going to twist and flex the way it's supposed to, and all my gaps are hopefully going to stay that way after I get everything back into the car. But really now the fender is on as far as the rear part. So now this is good. I got a good gap in here. This is all good because we were able to tighten the bolt up in here. So let's move up a bit. So we were able to tighten this up. This is not bad because we can move the fender in and out. So really now the last thing I need to do is move to the front of the car, get the balance tied in, get the inner bolts into it, and the fender's on. And we can now start officially with the bodywork. Okay, 2 bolts are in. The fender and the front valance are bolted together. The line is terrible, but I expected it to be terrible because, I mean, the valance has been on this car for 50 years and it's probably hit as many things as over that time as who knows what. So what am I going to do? I'm going to spend now probably the next week or 2 with a wrench and a hammer and dolly, and I'm going to try to flatten every surface where they meet. So obviously where the valance meets the fender, I'm going to try to manipulate that by loosening the bolts and moving the panels. If that doesn't work, I'm going to have to hammer and dolly to move the metal to get a nice sharp edge. But I'm going to have to do that everywhere on this car. So everywhere that the fender meets the cowl, where the fender meets the door, where the fender meets the rocker, everywhere the 2 pieces of metal come together, in order to get them flat, you're going to either have to adjust the panel or beat the panel with a hammer. And that's probably going to take me the next couple of weeks just to get around this car one time to do that. Once we're close, I'm going to be able to then start using filler to flatten. The cars weren't flat to begin with, so thinking you can flatten it by just manipulating the panels, you know, that's a tall order. But basically I'm going to use the filler just to flatten the car out. So once the car is flat, we can look at paint. Now paint, thank goodness, by the time I'm thinking about painting this car, we're going to be into April here in Canada. It's February now. And by the time I'm into April, we're going to have some nice days. So I'm going to be able to warm the garage up way more than it is now. I mean, I'm barely at 60 degrees. You know, just keep it tolerable, right? I can't overheat the garage, and the metal's cold, right? So you don't want to paint cold metal. So the idea is I need a nicer day to paint, but got a lot to do. Bodywork. Going to be doing the filling to flatten. Then we're going to spray the car in 2K, and then I'm going to flatten the car with the primer. And then once all of that is done, I've still got my engine coming back from the rebuilder. As we know, I had to send it out. The pistons were out of tolerance. They were about 5,000th out of round, and that starts getting hard on the seals because you got the rings, the piston rings are round, and now they're in an oval cylinder, and that can lose compression, that can lose oil, it can burn. So you know what? Get the engine done. So I'm getting the engine done. So engine will be back probably in the next week or 2, so I'll be able to do a video on that. I've got a bag full of things that I took off of this car a year and a half ago, like the parking lights and the marker lights and the backup lights. They were a mess back then. I can only imagine they're still a mess. So I got that to do as well. And then of course there's always the electrical, right? I've still got to clean up all the wiring that's going to run into the trunk, and all the wiring that's going to run for the power roof, and of course the wiring for the seats. So I've got a lot of things I'm going to be videotaping. Am I going to be videotaping me doing body work? Probably not. I mean, because basically, as I mentioned to you earlier, if you want to know how to do body work and flatten a car out, you know, go visit Barry over at Joe Daddy's Garage, because he's done it on multiple cars with multiple problems, and you know, you'll learn a lot more watching him than me. I'm always going to be the one who will be videoing things like putting holes in hoods so you can put locks in, and you know, changing MKX seats into looking like their original seats and things like that. And I'll continue to do that as well. Keep it interesting. But thank you for watching. Hit that like button if you enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you soon.